All right, hello again. Welcome to another biology video. As you can see, this one is about body systems, how the body is structured to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is something that we saw before. We watched this video called about something called persistence hunting, where this dude and his friends chased a kudu around until the kudu collapsed, um, and the human didn't. And we had determined that that was because the kudu could not maintain something called homeostasis while the human could. Homeostasis is the ability to maintain a constant environment inside of your body. You need all sorts of different situations, such as the oxygen levels and energy levels and pH levels and blood sugar levels, that need to stay very constant. And if they go up too high, that's bad. And if they get too low, that's bad. And you have to keep them normal. They have to be within normal ranges. In particular, in the persistence hunting video, temperature is something that the kudu could not keep its temperature maintained. It was getting too hot. And while the human was able to keep his temperature normal enough to keep running and running and running, right? And so that led us to doing this gizmo, where this time the human is just going to run, and the environment is going to change, and your job was to keep the human running, right? And so you had all these different things like your water level that you had to make sure that you kept track of, and as the water level went down, you had to do something, in this case drink water, to get that water back. As you exercise, your energy levels go down, so you need to eat food. um, the temperature is changing, so then you need to maybe add clothing or remove clothing. You had to determine how much you were going to sweat, and you could change these things. But then after you've started to play it, you started to realize that some of these things you change them, and then after you change them, they cause a problem. Like again, when you sweat, if you put this too far over, you would cool down, but then suddenly you'd start to get too cold, and you're like, oh crap, I need to change the sweat back down to lower, but then it's already too cold. So then you maybe need to add clothing, then maybe you need to shiver, and there's all these things, right? And this is what your body does on a moment to moment basis to keep you running. And it has to juggle all of these different conditions, all of these different systems and mechanisms to keep everything within the normal ranges. Again, that's something called homeostasis. So again, what we want to talk about today is how that happens. And so this question was on the video assignment going back a couple weeks now, where after you watch the video, I asked you not just what happened, but how did it happen? What is happening in the hunter's body? And as you can see, these three answers are the top answers, the answers that came up in almost every single person's response. Of course, the biggest thing that I had already mentioned that we talked about so far is that the human can sweat. Meanwhile, the kudu could not sweat, right? So the human can sweat. That's awesome. But sweating, how does that happen? What is happening inside of your body to make this liquid come out of you, right? Not too many people went farther than that. Of course, you need lungs to breathe, but everyone knows you need lungs, right? But maybe lungs have to do how do lungs work? What is happening inside of the lungs? And then, of course, I like this one. A lot of people have said he has legs, and it's like, okay, awesome, that's good too. But what are legs made out of, and how do legs work? And so there were other people who talked about the fact that there's all these different organs and systems that are important, that if you want to sweat, you would probably need an integumentary system, a fancy word for skin, right? In particular, hairless skin, or nearly hairless, not furry kind of skin, right? Legs require muscles and bones. Maybe when people didn't say these things, it's just too obvious. Maybe you're thinking, oh, why would I have to say that they need bones? But your bones are important, and the kinds of bones you have are important, whether you have like hollow bones like a bird, or sturdy bones like a mammal. That would change how your ability to run, or to absorb impacts, or whatever it's going to be. Some people talked about how the human needed a digestive system, because that's where you get the nutrients out of your food, or that's how you absorb the water that you're going to drink, right? And so there's all of these body parts that are required to help you maintain homeostasis, and they all have to work together. The only one that doesn't really need to work together to make you live on a moment-to-moment basis is the reproductive system. Of course, you need that at some point if you want to, like, your species to exist. But to survive, you don't technically need a reproductive system. But the system part that's just the surface, right? And that's probably something you've already learned about before. Maybe you don't remember all of those different names, but you know that your body's made out of all these different parts. But what we want to go to is the idea that those parts are made out of cells, and that this little girl has a bunch of systems. She needs a digestive system, but that system is made out of smaller parts called organs. And then the stomach is one of the organs out of the digestive system. But then the stomach itself is made out of smaller pieces called tissues. In particular, something you might not know is that your stomach is basically a big sack made out of muscles, smooth muscle to help your stomach contract and squeeze and push the food through. It also has skin, which we normally call epithelial tissue. That's the sciencey way of saying skin on the very inside and around the outside, right? So you have this muscle that's wrapped in skin on both sides. That's hollow. That's the organ, right? The organ is made out of these tissues, but the tissues are made out of cells. And the muscle cells that are in your stomach are not the kinds of cells that are in your muscles themselves, or your heart, which is also made out of muscle. Of course, we've already spent time talking about how we're made out of molecules and things like that. But it's important that if we're going to talk about homeostasis, that we realize that one organism is actually trillions of cells, at least if you're talking about a human, and each of those cells has its own problems, just like you do. You need to eat because your food needs energy and oxygen, and you need to breathe so that your cells can get oxygen, right? You have to eliminate waste because your cells keep dumping that into your body, right? You are your cells. And so when we think about the challenges of life, such as getting food, if you only have one cell, like this paramecium right here, it's pretty straightforward. You just go over to the food particle and you just absorb it into your body, and then you break it down into tiny little pieces, and then you use it. But if you're a human, you need all these different parts to work together because you have to feed all 100 trillion of your cells. Right? And so then when I look on the cellular level, over here, nothing changes because the cell, in this case, is an organism. But on the human side, we have all these little pieces that need to work together. And there's lots of different kinds of cells that go with all our different organs. I'm only going to focus on one of them this time, called the organs and cells of the circulatory system, as you can see. This is one of the most important systems for a multicellular organism because we do have to get all that food from one place to the next. We need to transport the molecules throughout our body, whether that's food or oxygen, or we're taking the CO2 away from our cells, whatever it needs to be. We have to get that done, and that's what, of course, our circulatory system's for. Hopefully you already knew that part. Maybe you didn't know how much it has to do with temperature, which is something that we'll talk about. But the basic idea is that liquid carries heat, and our blood is liquid, so our blood can carry heat around our body. I always find it interesting that these kinds of pictures make everything really clear, but then here's what happens if you inject a dead body with plastic before you then get rid of all the muscles and bones and stuff, right? Like this is basically a plastic mold of all the blood vessels inside of you. And of course, that's much more realistic than this one, right? I always used to think like, well, what's going on right here? Like there's an empty space right in there. Like, don't those things need blood? And then you look here and you're like, oh, wait, that isn't an empty space. That's just like a big old clump of things. And we just don't draw them all on here, right? But the circulatory system is made out of organs like the heart, of course, and blood vessels. But then those organs are made out of tissues and cells and stuff, right? And so how does our circulatory system keep us going when we're running? The first thing is that running requires energy, right? The more this little dude exercises, the more oxygen is going to need. This graph shows that as you work harder, you have to go higher up and higher up on the graph, meaning that you need more and more oxygen, right? And so that means every cell in your body, right? Of course, you breathe harder, that's of course something that's important, but also you're breathing harder so that you can get more oxygen to your cells. But your cells, like in your legs, are not near your lungs. And again, this is where the circulatory system comes in. And so your heart has to start pumping faster, right? The pulse rate will go up. Your heart starts beating so that you can push the blood through quicker and carry more oxygen to cells. The heart is made out of interesting cells called cardiac cells. They are different than other muscle cells, but you see a picture of them right here, right? You don't see it on the big organ, but those cells are significantly different from the cells that I showed you before that were like skin cells. Cardiac cells are especially interesting because they actually beat on their own. This heart that's over here on the right, of course, that's like a real person's heart, and it's getting ready for a transplant, and it's just beating because the cells automatically squeeze. That's one of the things that's interesting about that type of cell, right? You wouldn't want that kind of cell to be in your muscles unless you wanted your muscles to constantly be squeezing and contracting all the time, which you wouldn't, which is why it's not that way. If you pump your heart faster, there's a problem though, because this increases your blood pressure. And so you have these arteries, and arteries are a great way to look at the differences between a organ, the artery, and then the tissue that it's made out of, because arteries are basically tubes. You can see it in both of these pictures here. But this picture has like a cutaway, and you notice that the tube basically has an outside wrapper. Let me use a different color here, right? An outside part right there, right? And that's basically skin and elastic fibers, right? So that's like cartilage and connective tissue. And there's an inside wrapper that's also basically like skin, that's stretchy with all these like kinds of collagen fibers and things like that. And then on the inside, you have muscle, right? So this part in here is all muscle. Right? So again, you think of your blood vessels, or maybe you never thought of it, but they basically just like tubes, like a straw. But this straw has layers to it, and the layers are made out of different types of tissues that all have to work together just to make this one organ. Of course, again, just to remind us that this organ then needs the other organs to make the system, and then the system, of course, needs the other systems like the respiratory system for this all to work. Now, why do we need all this fancy tube? Why can't we just make it like a straw? Because we want our straws to move. We want them to expand or contract. And this is what muscle helps us do, right? When we can contract our muscle that squeezes, and when we relax our muscles and they expand. And this allows you to change the volume of your blood vessels. And in this case, you want your blood vessels to get bigger so that it'll allow the blood to flow faster, right? A bigger tube should work better. Right? And so there's just another example of how all these different cells and tissues and organs work together. And then, of course, doing all this exercise produces heat, especially in your heart. The center of your body is the hottest part of your body because your heart is just pumping and pumping and making heat all the time. Of course, as this then your heart starts pumping faster, which now means your blood is going to start carrying that heat all over your body. And so you have to do something. And of course you have to sweat. And sweating comes from your skin. And so here's just a cross section of skin just to show you that here's a sweat gland. It's just one little piece. Here's the tube that the sweat comes out of. One piece out of all these other different pieces that are different tissues and different cells, all making one organ that we would just call skin, right? Here's your outer layer of skin, and then you have the under layer of skin. This is the part that I'm coloring right now. This part's the part that like hurts when you cut it. Then underneath that, you have a layer of fat. That's what all this yellow stuff is. And there's different kinds of cells for fat cells. There's different kinds of cells for the bottom layer of the skin. There's different kinds of cells for the outer layer of skin. Of course, hair is a totally different thing, right? So there's all these different tissues that make up the organs, right? It's important that our skin has no hair so that we can let our sweat carry away the heat, right? And so here again is an example where it shows the skin. Here's the outside layer of the skin, and right underneath the skin, there's all these blood vessels. And in this picture, the blood vessels have gotten bigger. They are dilated. This is when you're running, and this is when you have all this extra blood flowing through you. It's not extra blood flowing through you, it's flowing through you faster through the bigger tubes. And then you have your sweat that happens along the outside here, and the sweat starts to evaporate. And as the sweat evaporates, it carries the heat away, right? And this allows you to cool off. Other animals, mammals especially, who have a lot of fur, if they were to try to sweat, it would just make their fur really damp and wet, and it wouldn't evaporate, and it would just make them really like, I don't know, kind of suffocated by having all this really heavy, wet fur all over them. We don't have that problem because, again, we don't have any fur. But this is just another way that we use our circulatory system to help us lose heat. In this case, we send the blood to our skin where it can evaporate the heat, the water can evaporate the heat away. Here's a picture, a heat map that shows just a normal person who just happens to be standing like that. And you can see in the center of the person's body is where all the heat is. On the outsides of the body, it isn't very hot because we normally, all the heat is in our chest, and then it starts to spread out through our limbs, and it gets colder as it moves away from us. This is the heat map from a girl who just finished PE class, and you can see that her skin is bright red because she's been producing a ton of heat in her core and her abdomen where her heart is, because it's pumping so fast. And then all that heat needs to go to the skin as soon as it can, so that it can, the sweat can carry that heat away, right? Here is another version that just shows you that if it's cold outside, you're going to keep all the heat on the inside. If it's hot, you're going to start to try to push the heat to the outside of your body so that you can lose the heat, depending on how that works, right? And so again, this is, and actually I forgot I have one more picture here. This lady has something called Raynaud's syndrome, which is a problem with your blood vessels. Her body has shut off the blood to these fingers, mistakenly, of course. Her body thinks that it's going to be really cold, and so it shuts off the blood here so it can keep the blood closer to her heart. But of course, you can see the other fingers didn't get that message. It's only something that's happening there. So just you can see literally where the blood and the heat are, or in this case, are not, right? So we've seen all these different organs and tissues and cells. And so this week's assignment is to go on to this gizmo, which is about cell types. You're going to go on here and you are going to, and actually I have it right here, you're going to take samples. In this case, I've chosen a leaf, but there's a bacteria from the cow or the brain. If you get lost, you click this button and it shows you all the different things you could click. You're going to click on pretty much all these eventually. But the cool thing about this one is that then you go over here and you take that sample and put it on a microscope. And this would have been the part of the year where we got to work with microscopes, which sucks. But this one kind of gets the point where you have to like focus the microscope, and then you have to like zoom in. There's all these things you could do, and there's labels and scale bars to show sizes and all kinds of things, right? So you're just going to go through this worksheet just like last time. It's going to tell you what to do. You're going to fill in all the answers as you go along using the gizmo, and then you're going to turn that into the PowerSchool Dropbox as usual by the end of the week, by Sunday night. And this one will tell you all about the different kinds of cells. And then after you do it, there'll be another video to wrap that up just like this time. Let me know if you have any problems. As usual, hit me up on Google Hangouts or email me or whatnot. Otherwise, good luck.